I think some of you may not know that Human Rights Watch began in 1978 under the name the Fund for Free Expression. It was started by writers and publishers who were trying to express solidarity with persecuted writers and publishers in the then former Soviet Union, And I share their view that free expression is extremely important. It's a key right. Its repression is the first symptom of worse abuse, and its protection is often the best hope for exposing and reversing other rights violations. And for that reason, I thought it was very important to try to assess the state of free expression in the years since 9/11. Those years saw a frightening weakening on the commitment of nations to some of the most basic human rights norms, the prohibition against torture, against arbitrary detention, against due process, and I thought it was time to look at free expression also. But it was surprisingly difficult to get a very wide view. I think ordinary people have a sense of what constitutes torture, even if the Bush administration sometimes gets confused. But free expression is diffuse. It protects everyone from the famous author to the teenage blogger, the woman who wears a headscarf to the cross-dresser, and the defender of human rights to the genocide denier. The erosion of the norm against torture is alarming because the norm is absolute. There are no other interests to balance under the law. But the right to free expression can be qualified in light of public security, public order, morality, the rights of others. So in an age where the world is very preoccupied with terrorism and where religion has become a flashpoint, states are very quick to see threats to national security. Global migration and global communications have also made states very anxious and eager to regulate minorities and ideas. All these trends have narrowed public space for debate, and I think much to the detriment of genuine security. So it's important to recall that all limitations on speech must be only those that are necessary in a democracy, as speech is, after all, intrinsic to democracy. There's little doubt that journalists and writers are under attack, physical attack as never before, for exposing that which the state would prefer to leave covered. And we see this in real battlefields such as Iraq and the Philippines, as well as battlefields of principle, as in Russia and in Turkey, where we mourn Anna Politkovskaya and Hrant Dink. Long experience shows that legal attacks on writers often encourage physical attacks. Regardless of which individual is to blame for these deaths, the state bears some responsibility because legal attacks send a public signal that the state has withdrawn some measure of its protection. Even in the United States, which remains one of the most favorable climates for critical reporting, the present administration has reclassified government information. It started leak investigations around major newspapers that broke stories on government misconduct, such as Abu Ghraib, secret detention, illegal government surveillance. And it's testing the grounds for prosecuting those who receive leaks of classified information. This is a very new development in American law. This will inevitably provide new excuses and cover for governments that seek to silence dissent. The martyrdom of writers shocks us and demands world attention, as it ought to. But because I'm a lawyer, I would like to spend the remainder of my remarks focusing on some less publicized but very important legal trends. And the first of these is the proliferation of the relatively new crimes of glorification or apology of terrorism, as well as indirect incitement. Now, incitement to commit a crime is an offense in most legal systems, and of course, incitement to terrorism as well. The crime of direct incitement requires that the state prove that the message directly encourages the commission of a crime, that the speaker intends this, whether or not the criminal act results. And in some jurisdictions, such as the United States, incitement also must present a risk of imminent action. In Europe, the causal proximity between the speech and the crime is somewhat looser. But what's new is the proliferation of crimes of indirect incitement, that is, criminalizing speech that has some theoretical potential to incite criminal action, but which isn't plainly intended to have this effect. And these various laws sometimes suggest that the prescribed speech must merely show terrorism or terrorists, however you define them, in a positive light. It doesn't require always that speech be specifically intended to spur criminal acts or that it present a real risk of doing so under the circumstances. In 2004, only 3 European countries had laws against apology or glorification of terrorism. But by the middle of November 2006, there were about 36 countries that had signed the Council of Europe Convention on Terrorism, which requires states to criminalize provocation, a crime which could also include indirect incitement. In domestic law, Spain and France had apology laws on their books before 2001. The United Kingdom and Denmark more recently adopted laws on promotion or glorification of terrorist acts. And Turkey and Russia in 2006 amended terrorism legislations in ways that would punish speech characterized respectively as either propaganda for terrorism or support of extremism. Where the letter of the law is vague, the implementation of the law can be sweeping. And what looks like propaganda to a state prosecutor may be quite different than what an author intended or the public understood. Another unwelcome development has been a new attention to crimes of hate speech and variants of blasphemy and genocide denial. Hate speech against a religious, ethnic, or national group is truly hateful, and not only because it inflicts psychological harm, but because it also can facilitate and encourage violence, discrimination, and other criminal acts against targets. The drafters of the key international human rights treaties emphasize that states must prohibit hate speech, but not to enshrine some political correctness with regard to minorities, but to protect minorities from the dehumanization that led to massive crimes against humanity. Over time, however, another rationale for banning hate speech has gained currency, that of asserting the equality of minorities, often through prohibiting what have been taken to be insults. The clash of rationales for hate speech can be seen in the Danish cartoon controversy, where it's undeniable that many of the cartoons were offensive and derogatory, and their publication a questionable judgment. But freedom of expression exists to protect offensive speech. We obviously don't need to protect inoffensive speech. Nobody objects. It was very far from clear that the cartoons in any way posed a direct threat to Muslims in Denmark or anywhere else. Subsequent calls from Muslim governments, such as Pakistan, to outlaw defamation of Islam underscored just how far the debate had shifted into the dubious territory of blasphemy offenses, and Alexis usefully referred to the new Human Rights Council resolution, which specifically endorses blasphemy offenses. It's a very serious development. The rationale for crimes of genocide denial underwent a similar shift historically. Sometimes they've been crafted to genuinely prevent incitement to genocide or other criminal acts in societies where the memory of such atrocities is fresh. But in fact, Holocaust denial laws proliferated decades after the end of World War II, mostly as a mark of political affirmation of multiculturalism and equality. The current interest in Switzerland and France for sanctioning those that deny Turkey's massacre of Armenians was a genocide has to be taken as more to do with domestic politics than with preventing violence. But Turkey also should be taken to task for prosecuting those who suggest these events were genocide. Curtailing debate through the criminal law is hardly likely to move anyone closer to reconciliation. One need only look at Rwanda, where the governing party has indiscriminately hurled the charge of genocide denial, negationism, against those who criticize it. And you can see the potential for such laws to invite censorship, oppression, and further divide society. The use of speech crimes against speakers whose views may offend but pose no imminent danger harms public discourse and public safety. It drives the debate needed in democracies underground. It makes martyrs out of cranks. You only need to look at Austria's conviction of David Irving, an apologist for the Nazis, whose fade into obscurity was only halted by his trial in February last year. Speech crimes alienate the very communities we depend on to inhibit terrorism, and they foster a public discourse of recrimination rather than self-reflection and tolerance. But that's not to say that hate speech or genocide denial is harmless. It is harmful, which is all the more reason that in robust democracies, officials should never engage in it, and governments should provide the liberty to counter it. Now, the two developments I've mentioned, the proliferation of terrorism-related speech crimes and the revival of hate speech and blasphemy crimes, are related, of course. The Danish cartoons stirred protest around the world because the cartoons symbolized a perception that the West had equated terrorism with Islam. Now, there's often a synergy between the perception of insult to official institutions and a threat to national security as well. You can see this in many countries, including Turkey, where both rationales underpin abusive prosecutions. The Russian definition of extremism, for example, includes criticism of state officials. In this regard, it's useful for us to dust off the Johannesburg Principles of 1995, which codify the best practices of many states in regulating in the name of national security. They define as legitimate national security interests whose genuine purpose and demonstrable effect is to protect a country's existence or its territorial integrity against the use or threat of force, or its capacity to respond to the use or threat of force. Protecting the state against embarrassment, insult, industrial unrest, exposure of wrongdoing, or ideological deviance are simply not interests which can justify censoring individuals, much less throwing them in jail. We have to keep reminding ourselves that security does not depend on enforcing respect for theology, for particular ideologies, or for the state. If anything, the opposite is true. Security in mature democracies depends on enforcing respect for the dignity of the individual and for mutual tolerance. This is very easy to forget in times of crisis or political tension, but if anything, more vital. Most of these struggles are at some level wars of ideas, and the battle is lost when governments respond to injury and terror with injury and terror. Thank you.